Good evening, my fellow citizens. This government, as promised, has maintained the closest surveillance of the Soviet military buildup on the island of Cuba. Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island. The purpose of these bases can be none other than to provide a nuclear strike capability against the Western Hemisphere.
With those words, the public portion of the Cuban Missile Crisis had begun. What had brought the world to this point? How did Americans respond? And how was the crisis resolved? Through archival images, historic footage, and first-person memories, we explored those questions in this episode of History in the First Person, the Cuban Missile Crisis. I'm Tim Gore, your host for the program, and I'm very happy to welcome you to the History in the First Person series. And we're going to have the chance to meet some folks who have memories of what it was like as we learned what President Kennedy was just talking about. That nuclear missiles, the possibility of nuclear weapons in Cuba, what did that mean to America and the rest of the world at the time? As always, we're being joined by interactive student groups across the country. Those groups I'll be coming to in a little bit. But don't forget, if you're watching us on the web or on television, then you can send us your questions and comments during the program via email. Just email us at live@hectv.org. That's live@hectv.org. I'll get them on my phone here, and I look forward to working your email questions into the program as well. On October 22nd, 1962, President Kennedy made the beginnings of that speech to the nation. He also had a few more things to say as well. Let's hear a little bit of the rest of the speech now.
Acting, therefore, in the defense of our own security and of the entire Western Hemisphere, and under the authority entrusted to me by the Constitution, as endorsed by the resolution of the Congress, shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response upon the vindication of right.
By the time President Kennedy made that announcement to the nation, he had known just for a little bit less than a week that the CIA had confirmed through various photo reconnaissance missions that indeed Soviets were building nuclear weapon sites, tactical and both long-range nuclear weapon sites in Cuba. On the 18th, he had actually met with Ambassador Dobrynin and Gromyko, Foreign Minister Gromyko, in the White House, and they had denied the fact that this was occurring. So he was armed with a variety of details by this point in time, and America was ready to move forward. The nation now heard that information. How did they respond? Well, that's what our guests are going to let us have a little understanding about today, what it was like to live in America at that time. Our first guest, Elizabeth Gorin. Elizabeth, thanks so much for joining us this morning.
I'm glad to do it, Tim. think it's an interesting subject, and yes, I do remember.
So at the time, in 1962, you were living in Miami, Florida, correct?
Correct.
And how old were you, Elizabeth?
In 62, I would have been 19.
So you were on your own?
So I was on my own, yes. And it was a shock, the whole Cuban Missile thing. It was, we lived through the Cold War, so we were accustomed to that, but we were not accustomed to something in our backyard. It was in another part of the world, not here. And suddenly it was in our backyard, 90 miles away. 90
miles away, and I think that's an important thing for everybody to understand, 90 miles away. We've got a couple of images we want to show you that are maps. And what you see here on these different arrows are the distances between Cuba and various locations. And you can see that Miami's very close, for sure, as well as other parts of the United States. And the next map we want to show you is actually a declassified CIA map. This map would have been used by the CIA as they were talking to President Kennedy at the time, to show him the ranges of different types of missiles that were armed in Cuba. So living in Miami, living in southern Florida, Elizabeth, this was significantly worrisome to you.
Oh, absolutely. It was something we expected. Never expected to happen, but we thought, gee, we're right there. We're going to be hit first. And it was scary, very scary.
Do you remember Kennedy's speech?
Oh, yes. Yes, I do. I don't remember it verbatim, but I remember the feeling that it left. It was just, horrible. It was such a shock. And as I said before, you don't think of anything like that in your backyard.
And you had not always lived in Miami. Your family originally had come from?
New York.
So you had come from like one major city down to Miami.
Right.
Now, did you still have family and friends up in New York City as well?
Yes, we did. And of course, that was a concern because really, if you think about it logically, Miami wouldn't be a prime target. New York and Washington would be the prime targets, not Miami. And of course, when we thought about it, that worried us too. But of course, this was in a time where everyone was fearful of radiation and fallout and what have you. So just hitting anywhere in America was a terrible thing, and it frightened us all.
And that handsome man with you is?
That was a high school boyfriend.
So let's begin to go to some questions from our student groups, because I know they're going to have questions for you and all of our guests. And I'm going to start out in Pennsylvania, Johnstown, Pennsylvania, with Westmont Hilltop High School. Because, Sean, I know you've got a first question about discovery of missiles. So, Sean, I'll go to you if you'd like to introduce yourself and speak loudly and proudly. What's your question?
How did the United States discover missiles in Cuba?
Thanks, Sean. That's a great question. He asked specifically about how we discovered the missiles in Cuba. Now, Kennedy spoke a little bit about that in his speech, right? Did you begin then to learn how we understood the missiles were there?
It was because of the U-2 spy planes that they flew very high altitudes with cameras that could pick up things on the ground. This was before satellites. The satellites weren't around.
And that's an important thing, I think, for our audience to understand, especially our young audience of students. There are a few satellites up in the sky, but they don't have the kind of capability that we do today, obviously, of zeroing in on location. So we were using spy planes, and we've got a couple of images for you. This is probably the most famous of the spy planes that would have been utilized during the Cold War. You may be familiar with Gary Powers, a U-2 spy plane pilot who was shot down over the Soviet Union during the height of the Cold War. This plane would have been flying high-level reconnaissance missions, for sure. But there's another really interesting spy plane that was built by McDonnell Douglas right here in St. Louis, known as the Voodoo. And we're going to bring up that image now. And this plane actually gave us a lot of the low-level reconnaissance flights that really let us see the missile sites up close and personal. And we're going to give you guys a chance to look at those sites as we begin to answer Sean's question. So if we look at this one, this is a place in Cuba which at this point in time doesn't look like anything's happening. This image was actually taken in late August of 1962. However, notice the area in the box that you're going to see there over on the left-hand side of the picture. As we switch to the next image, which was taken in the middle of October 1962, this is what was existing at that time then in that box that we just saw. So by the time that October rolled around, they indeed had all sorts of things about nuclear warhead sites, they had construction materials, they had all sorts of reasons to believe that this was a definite nuclear location. Our next two images show you the exact same things, which again shows you an area of Cuba in late August, where ideally speaking you don't see a heck of a lot, but some clouds and open farmland. But as we go to the next image, you're going to notice that at this point in time, the site has become quite different, and this is a close-up picture taken from that Voodoo aircraft where you can really see the fact that there's all sorts of trucks, track marks because of construction. They believe that there's a missile erector just behind that long building you see in the center of the picture. All of these things would have been analyzed by CIA operatives. And it's this kind of pictures, Elizabeth, that eventually the media was showing and you guys were aware that were out there?
Yes, we saw the pictures, but like satellite pictures today, we couldn't see as well as the experts, but we believed them.
That's right. I think that's an important thing for everybody to understand is that you have to trust that the experts are identifying the objects correctly. This is a missile site. This is a missile erector. These are trucks. This is a weapon itself.
Exactly.
Newsreel footage of the time can really be helpful. And of course, today when you go to movies, you don't see newsreels at all. But back when I was a small kid, you could go to the movies and you'd see newsreels all the time. And here's some newsreel footage of the U-2 spy plane.
The United States arrived at the decision for an arms blockade after studying reconnaissance photographs made with high-powered cameras from planes flying several miles from the Cuban coast. These cameras are described as capable of spotting a golf ball on a putting green from 40,000 feet. Literally thousands of pictures can be made on each flight by these planes, and they are studied by photo interpreters who are capable of analyzing details that an untrained eye would miss. Here, for example, is a medium-range ballistic missile base that has been labeled by these specialists. Suddenly, the veil is torn from the Russian secrets.
There you see an example of the U-2 spy plane in operation, and the size of that camera, my gosh, that camera is huge. Let's see what other questions students have. The Westchester Opportunity Center in Yonkers, New York. Yonkers, a question from you all?
I wanted to know, what safeguards did you and your family and community make in preparation for the event of nuclear war, and what relief did you feel to know that they weren't needed after a while?
Super question in terms of the safeguards that your family took and the whole nation was taking in terms of preparing for nuclear war and some emergency action. I'm going to let you speak to that because we've got some great video for the students to see as well that deals with that.
Well, first of all, most of us felt like there wasn't a whole lot we could do. We did have neighbors. We had one particular neighbor that at the time we thought they were a little crazy. They built a bomb shelter. But when this happened, when the crisis happened, we thought maybe they're not so stupid after all. But you think of it logically, the bomb shelter wouldn't have done any good, and not in Miami, it's not that deep. But there wasn't a whole lot we could do. I do know that my grandmother, when it happened, ran to the grocery store and bought a lot of sugar because she went through a sugar shortage during World War II, and she didn't want that to happen again.
Well, and I think that's an interesting thing for the students to understand, is that people who were adults at this time had lived through significant other events in their youth, World War II, which certainly colored their vision of how they were going to respond to this.
Right, and that was the big thing. She realized that she had, because there was rationing during the war, that sugar was the most important thing to her. But most of us, we just had to go on with our daily lives. There wasn't anything we could do about it.
Elizabeth, thanks so much for being here. But while Elizabeth switches out and we're going to invite our second guest to come out, I'm going to go to another video which is perfect in relationship to the question we just got from the folks in Yonkers, New York. We're going to go to a little bit of the duck and cover video. Speaking of getting prepared for a nuclear attack, this is a film that would have been played in your elementary school.
Dum dum, diddle dum dum, diddle dum dum, diddle dum dum. There was a turtle by the name of Bert, and Bert the turtle was very alert. When danger threatened him, he never got hurt. He knew just what to do. He ducked and cover, ducked and cover.
He did what we all must learn to do. You
and you
and you
and you, duck and cover.
Be sure and remember what Bert the Turtle just did, friends, because every one of us must remember to do the same thing. That's what this film is all about. Duck and cover. This is an official civil defense film produced in cooperation with the Federal Civil Defense Administration and in consultation with the Safety Commission of the National Education Association.
And so there you are with a little bit of the duck and cover civil defense film. Which I remember vividly being in elementary school watching. And our second guest, Ron Jackson, is here with us. At the time of the crisis, he was actually in the Army Reserve, which we'll talk about a bit. But Ron, in your elementary school years, did you guys watch films like that and do duck and cover drills?
We were small children at the time, and it was very confusing. And even to this day, it's a bit traumatic to think about it. It was scary.
And so in 1962, at the time of the crisis itself, you were in the Army Reserve. You would have been what age at that point?
24 years old. I just finished basic training at Fort Knox in Kentucky and had been transferred to Fort Polk, Louisiana, being trained as advanced infantry. And the news broke. And we were all very concerned because we were prime cannon fodder. we were ready to go, and we were in Louisiana, Fort Polk, Louisiana, which is very close to Cuba. So after our training day was over with, we'd go back to the day room, which we would normally play ping pong or pool or this type thing, and everybody's eyes were glued to the TV. Just really worried about what the next step was going to be. And that went on, I think, for 13 days. And they were loading the tanks onto the flat cars. And they did that quite often just to posture or to bluff. But at this time, they were loading the tanks with the ammunition, and they never included the ammunition unless it was real. So we knew that it was very serious. And at least from my perspective, I think we came terribly close to having a nuclear war. And it's just certainly grateful that it didn't go that route.
What other questions do our student groups have? Let's go back to Pennsylvania. Come on in, Johnstown. What would you like to know?
How were the missiles transported from the Soviet Union to Cuba?
Oh, thanks very much. The question from them is, how were the missiles transported from the Soviet Union to Cuba? Well, we've got some images of that because they came aboard ship is what they did. And this is the Poltava, if I'm remembering it correctly. And the objects that you see covered on the ship are actually parts of a nuclear weapon. In our next picture, you're going to see another ship from that period of time that was also covering things. And you're going to notice they called this cratology, which was an interesting CIA term. You see the big crates that are on the boat? They were trying to figure out what was inside the crate. Now, of course, the CIA had all sorts of pictures of what Soviet missiles would look like, what the parts would look like, how they would be broken down, etc. So they were trying to interpret what would fit into those kinds of different crates. And our next image just gives you another picture again. And at this point, you're seeing all sorts of parts of missile erector pieces, fuselages that are there at the front. All of these kinds of images were coming across to the CIA, and of course, eventually, the United States was presenting them to the United Nations and to the rest of the world. But that's how those things got to us, was via ship. Let's go to another student group. Slater, Missouri, another question from you guys.
Did you trust President Kennedy's decisions during the crisis?
So in terms of did you support President Kennedy's decision during the crisis? Did you think the quarantine was a good idea?
Oh, I'm glad that question was asked, because at the time, needless to say, I was scared. So I wrote a letter home. I was 24 at the time. Wrote a letter home to my mom and dad. I said, you know, I didn't vote for Kennedy. I don't agree with a lot of his policies, but he's absolutely right. We can't leave missiles 90 miles away from our shore, aimed at our cities that are nuclear missiles. We just can't do it. And I certainly didn't want to go to war, but sometimes you just can't let things go on.
And the image you're seeing up on the screen right now is of Kennedy signing the quarantine order. The image you saw previous to that was President Kennedy with General Curtis LeMay, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and other advisors, including one of the U-2 reconnaissance pilots. And there was a lot of conversation amongst the Kennedy administration, amongst the Joint Chiefs, about the best way to respond. There were people who wanted direct military action. There were people who wanted invasion. There were people who wanted to go ahead and nuke Cuba to start with. And Kennedy decided on the quarantine order as the middle road, which would hopefully be able to stop the Soviets from going over the brink.
The United States answer to what Adlai Stevenson termed Soviet blackmail in Cuba was a quarantine of all offensive weapons being shipped from Russia to that island fortress. The U.S. threw up a steel fence prepared to stop any vessel carrying materials of war. Meanwhile, the United States continues to reinforce its Cuban base at Guantanamo Bay, the naval depot that Castro wants the U.S. to give up. These Marines have been assigned the job of protecting the base against any Cuban threats that might arise during the present crisis. They'll be on a 24-hour alert, a first line of defense.
Something that everybody may not remember, Guantanamo is an American base on the island of Cuba from the time of the Spanish-American War, and we've had that presence there since that period of time. Now, we've got some images of video of air raid scrambles and soldiers going. You mentioned the idea that you had drills where they were putting the tanks onto the flatbed trucks and they armed with munitions.
Right.
In the same way that Ron would have been living those drills at his fort location, other soldiers were living different kinds of drills. And this is newsreel footage of those who would have been pilots and what they would do should the scramble order come to go to war.
And the Missouri Air National Guard would not be idle either. These pilots are taking a break in the daily routine. A moment of rest, they think. But that familiar buzzer breaks through the quiet base. A scramble has been called to seek out unidentified aircraft. Within a matter of minutes, the Air National Guard has jet fighters in the air, ready to stave off any attempt on the area.
Those types of scramble drills would have been done during the height of the Cold War anyway, but they were certainly done during the Cuban Missile Crisis. And if you're not familiar with the emergency system, there's something called Defcon, which was the different levels, and you didn't want to get to one. But during this crisis, we actually did get to DEFCON level 2. We've learned later as a result of CIA declassification. And it's my understanding that that's the only point in time, at least that we know about, that we've actually reached a DEFCON 2 level.
I think it is.
And of course, there may be things we don't know that they haven't declassified yet, but in terms of what they told us. And that strikes at a question that James sent us via email. James, thanks for sending it in. He asks, has there been any material declassified recently that shows what the public wasn't told? And interestingly enough, James, that's very, very true. We've learned just very recently that there were tactical nuclear weapons in Cuba that, in fact, the administration didn't know about. And that even though most of us think that the missile crisis ended at the end of those 13 days when Khrushchev said, okay, we're going to turn around and we're going to take everything out, and the UN decided to send the mission down there to make sure that happened, the tactical nuclear weapons were still in Cuba. And in fact, it was a Soviet ambassador to Castro who, in essence, kind of tricked him to get those missiles out because Castro wanted to keep them. And what we've learned is that the Soviet minister actually told him a lie, which indicated that there was a Soviet law that prevented permanent transfer of nuclear missiles. And so he had to give them back. So it wasn't until late December, I think it was about the 20th of December, when those final tactical nuclear weapons ended up back at Soviet bases, Soviet ports. So that's an example of some new information that we've learned. And of course, the public wasn't told at the end of the crisis that we had agreed under the table, so to speak, quietly, to remove our Jupiter missiles from Turkey, which were extremely close to the Soviet Union at the time as well. Yonkers, you get the final question from student groups. What would you like to know?
America is checking every country to see if they don't have building nuclear weapons.
Yes, the United Nations was, as the crisis came to an end, the United Nations was the organization that was checking the nuclear weapons. And in fact, we've got some newsreel footage of Secretary General U Thant meeting the group of people who's going to check those missiles.
The curtain goes up at the United Nations on what the world hopes is the final act in the drama that was the Cuban crisis. The Soviet Union is represented by Khrushchev's special envoy, Russia's first deputy foreign minister, Vasily Kuznetsov. He is here to confer with U Thant before the acting Secretary General left for Cuba to arrange the dismantling of Soviet missile bases. U Thant met separately with both Russian and United States representatives to iron out some preliminary details before his conferences with Castro. It is planned that observers from nations not allied with either side will supervise the removal of the sites. Then it is hoped the final curtain will fall.
Thank you, Ron Jackson, for being here. Elizabeth Gorin, thank you. Goodbye, everybody.